Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to join me to talk about how the FBI became the agency of mass surveillance. And the Supreme Court has made it harder to sue big banks, so we'll find out what can be done to hold them accountable. And some of the most powerful Republican think tanks are being left in the dust by the new breed of Republican extremists, and we'll tell you why that's going to hurt the GOP. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you've stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
This summer, we learned that the NSA has been spying on U.S. citizens without their knowledge, but that's only half of the story. The FBI has been doing this for decades, and I'm joined now by Ring of Fire co-host Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to tell us about the FBI's domestic surveillance programs. Bobby, you know, I thought after, when you go back and you read the Frank Church hearings that took place, where they tried to get the FBI back under control, go back and read those, the transcripts from those hearings. You think when you read that the problem was solved. Just the opposite is true, isn't it? If we take a look at where the FBI has moved today with surveillance, according to ACLU reports.
Well, yeah, the ACLU reports portray an agency that is really out of control. Actually, there's two reports that came out this week. One on the NSA, that is the most recent release of Edward Snowden's information, which shows that they are listening, that they are monitoring almost 2 billion telephone calls a day in the United States. The FBI is actually acting as a conduit for that information and gets to look at that information themselves. And as you point out, the agency has, you know, during the 1975, during the Church hearings following Watergate, the Congress tried to put the bit in the mouth of the FBI because Nixon had been using the FBI to spy on anti-war activists and his political enemies, and to engineer all kinds of illegal activities. And this is exactly what the country had been worried about, both liberals and conservatives, since the creation of the FBI. In fact, in 1955, when J. Edgar Hoover spoke, he was called before Congress and he was asked about wiretapping, and he said at that time that if he caught a single agent engaging in wiretapping, that agent would be dismissed immediately. And this reflected the mood of the country at that time and before that. You know, we didn't want to. There was a terrible debate in Congress in 1947 when they created the CIA, which was the predecessor to the NSA. But during World War II, prior to World War II, there were no intelligence agencies. There was no national intelligence agency in this country. So in order to gather intelligence during World War II, we created the OSS. But it was a wartime concession. Congress was scared that we would end up like, you know, they thought that national police agencies were antithetical to a democracy, that you couldn't have the two things at once. And when I was growing up, we associated national police agencies with, you know, with the KGB and the Stasi in East Germany, and Savak in Iran, and the Tonton-Macoutes in
Bobby,
Haiti, and all these other places.
Let me ask you a question here. The people seem to miss exactly what's happening right now. They think, okay, well, this is all really about this effort to try to monitor terrorism. But why don't you explain to the viewers where we see the FBI, where we see them tampering with our civil rights? What kind of places are they moving to? What are they doing to people to try to expand this?
You know, one of the ACLU, this recent ACLU report shows that really, it shows a really high level of incompetence in this agency that, we're entrusting these billions of dollars to monitor what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And for example, one of their programs is a racial profiling program that maps the country racially. Blacks here, Arabs here, Muslims here, Latinos here. They give the justification that, well, during the 1960s, the Black Panther Party was blowing up things, so we need to monitor all black people today. The FBI.
Mm-hmm.
We need to monitor Arabs, they say, because they are backward and violent. This is from their own studies and their own reports. And, part of this, I think, and one of the things the ACLU points out, Pap, is that the FBI really has not changed much since the 1960s. If you look at the demographics of the FBI, there are fewer than 17% of the people, of the G-men in the FBI are racial minorities, whereas 37% of the people in our country are racial minorities. Fewer than 5% of FBI agents are black. So, and I think it's 17% of our country is black. And so there's that ethic that J. Edgar Hoover started, at a time when the FBI was investigating civil rights groups. They were spying on Martin Luther King. They tried to force Martin Luther King to commit suicide. That was the objective of one of their missions. The question is, if we couldn't trust them then, why are we trusting them today? And the ACLU report, shows that the confidence level certainly has not increased.
I was very moved by that ACLU report, that you have to conclude it's not just that they're overreaching, it is they don't even understand the underpinnings of how they're overreaching or why they're overreaching. Now, I'm curious about this. Is it naive to believe that that there is no that there's no attempt by the FBI or the NSA to move right into our organizations in the United States, such as environmental activists or war activists or whatever it may be? Is it the Occupy movement, for example? Aren't we awfully naive if we think that this tool isn't being used right in areas like that we assume we have the right to do these things?
Well, we know that's the history of the FBI right through the 80s and the 90s, that they were investigating environmental groups and they were actually planning agents in environmental groups, whereas they weren't really investigating the right-wing paramilitary groups, the people who blew up, the federal building in Oklahoma City and who were involved in Waco and who were involved in all these paramilitary groups out in Idaho, etc. And the anti-abortion people who were killing people and who were blowing up, they were not classified as terrorists. But environmental groups, civil rights groups, the ACLU, civil liberties groups, those were the groups that were classified, characterized as terrorists. And I want to go back to this because, there's always been a fear, particularly in the right. If you look at Barry Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which was the Bible of the conservative movement, his big fear was big government. But it's not the Tea Party's view of big government, which is just, we don't want to pay our taxes. It is a government that is intrusive, that gets into your bedroom, that gets into your home, that looks at your relationship with other people. And now we find out that the NSA with the FBI is monitoring the TomTom in your car. It's monitoring the Waze application, which is the GPS application on your cell phone, to see where you've been. It's monitoring your airplane tickets. It's monitoring your Easy Pass. It's seeing who you travel with. It's looking for the 6 degrees of separation. It's monitoring your telephone calls. Virtually every telephone call that's made in this country is recorded and documented by the NSA, and it's taking what the these kind of meta knowledge, this meta information, and it's trying to develop metrics which connect people who are known terrorists or are suspected terrorists to people within the United States. Now, there's always been an ironclad law that the NSA and the CIA could not spy on Americans. And that law is now no longer the case in the United States. They are spying indiscriminately on Americans, the same as they are on foreign nationals.
Bobby, one thing I think you've talked about before, and I possibly have written about, it comes to my mind, is the idea of them taking this metadata, and they may just grab metadata just in huge swaths across the country, and then they take the metadata and they ship it out of the country. Okay, they may ship it to some place in Europe, or may ship it to Israel. We just saw the story about Israel looking through the metadata and then actually doing the spying for the United States on things completely unrelated to terrorism. Them looking through the metadata, saying, no, there's no way in the United States that there ever would have been a FISA court that would allow us to go any further with this metadata. But then they take the information that they glean from that and they ship it back to the United States for the FBI or the NSA, whoever, to do what they want to with that gleaned metadata. I think most people don't even understand how that works, do they? They don't understand the kickback aspect.
If you look at these reports, what they're really focused on, ironically, is not so much terrorism, but it's almost economic espionage and corporate espionage.
Right.
They're worried more about China. They're worried about Russia. They're worried about Brazil. They're looking at oil company data off of, and oil reserves off of the Brazilian coast.
Bobby, we're out of time, but what our reaction in the United States would be we'd be almost apoplectic if we found out that was happening to us.
Let me say one last thing, Pat, because this is about the merger of corporate and government power. What I found out this week is that the phone companies who are giving them that data, NSA, that data, are being paid for it, and they're making a fortune from it. So they are now collecting the data, and this is now part of their business model. Right. We're going to collect your data, and we're going to hand it over to the government.
Yeah, business as usual. Thank you, Bobby. When we come back, we'll look at how our tax dollars are being used to pay poverty wages to federal contract workers. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The government pays out billions of dollars every year in federal contracts for things like building roads, building bridges, and sewer systems. But the executives in charge of those contracts are using our tax money to pay their employees poverty wages. I'm joined now by attorneys Howard Nations and Kerry Jardine to tell us what's happening. Howard, it looks like American taxpayers are having to underwrite really low-paying, low-benefit jobs all over this country that just isn't helping the recession, isn't helping the economy at all.
Very true, Mike. You would think that the biggest cause of the people trying to reach the middle class and their failure to do so would be the low wages at McDonald's or Walmart. But the fact of the matter is that the largest single contingent of workers in the country who are underpaid as a group are those people who are funded by taxpayer dollars of money going to contractors. Taxpayers are fueling inequality. In 2012, there were $446.5 billion paid to contractors that was distributed to 2.2 million workers. Now, we have certain contingencies, which, as they should, engineers, doctors, scientists who work for these contractors who are well paid. But hundreds of billions of dollars go to companies that are paying very low wages. They're paying $12 or less per hour. And at the same time, many companies are paying highly exorbitant salaries to their execs.
Kerry, let me go to you on this. It's not that it's just wrong. It's not that it's just morally wrong, ethically wrong, that we should be paying government workers who really keep our infrastructure together in so many ways. It's not just wrong, but it causes harm to the economy, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that kind of one of the principal issues here?
Well, Mike, since the Davis-Bacon Act in 1931, the government has had the responsibility to set the standard for fair labor practices. And when you have low-wage earners, and Howard is right, when you have 560,000 federal workers that are earning poverty-level wages, it absolutely hurts the economy. They have less money to put into the economy. They pay less in taxes. They take more in terms of government benefits. They don't have the ability to move into the middle class. They don't have the ability to buy houses. I mean, it just ripples through the economy,
right.
And it does. It has a devastating effect on the economy.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the whole idea here, Kerry, that we want to rebuild our middle class? What are some of the Howard? What are some of the areas that we see this occurring, where we're taking taxpayers' dollars, we're giving it to contractors? In other words, government has just gone crazy with wanting to hire contractors to do virtually everything. So we take this money, we give it to the contractor, and then the contractor is involved in a race to the bottom on how little they can pay the worker. What are some areas we see this?
Well, the areas where we see this are in healthcare. They're in SBA-supported, Small Business Association-supported companies. A very large contingent of this comes from federal construction grants, and all the sorts of building maintenance, all the federal buildings that you see, all the federal parks, all those things that have to be maintained. Many of those are maintained through contractors. The private prison system, for example. The government pays the contractor pays the employees. And they're just simply allowing the employees at that level to fall through the cracks.
So, Kerry, if I heard what you said, we do have the Davis-Bacon Act, 1931. The purpose of that was to say, and then we have the executive orders that came after that, and the purpose was to say that we need to have laws that mandate companies that we give as taxpayers, that we give money to, that they're going to at least do something that we can be proud of in taking care of workers. I mean, employment practices, employment standards, ways that we take care of them in retirement, pensions, health care. All of that was contemplated in the 1931 Davis-Bacon Act, but we don't pay any attention to that anymore, do we?
You know, it's been eroded over time. In 1995, Congress came in and started to look at the level of executive pay, and they made some good strides there. But the problem is that the executives for these federal contractors were paid $24 billion in compensation last year alone, and while employing workers. Over 500,000 workers that are earning poverty-level wages. The problem is that there's an incentive for the executives to have a workforce that is at the poverty-level wages because more of the money flows into their pockets, and it just creates this continued inequality between the top 1%, the rich, and the low-wage earners. And that's what the Davis-Bacon Act, going back to the Great Depression, coming out of that and during that, they just recognized the government has to be the standard bearer on this. They have to set the example of high labor standards. People that are working for America, building the infrastructure here in America, they need to be earning wages that allow them to move into the middle class. But there seems to be an erosion, Michael. You're absolutely right. There seems to be an erosion on that's creating some serious problems.
Let's talk about. I mean, let's break this down. I mean, you've got a whole spectrum of occupations, as Howard pointed out. You got the military person who sews military uniforms. You've got hospital aides. You've got security guards that are contracted to protect public buildings. You have that food cart worker out at the National Zoo or other places around the country. You have so many things that we don't even think about that are all contracted by private industry, but taxpayers are paying that contractor. And we've almost forgotten the idea that we can say to that contractor, you know what? Part of the bidding process is going to be how you treat your workers. That's going to be part of it. Howard, you mentioned something I'm very interested in. That you say that there's been people at the bottom of this process, the person actually doing the day-to-day work, they're not getting paid an awful lot of money, but people at the top are seeing windfalls. How is the CEO pay at the top? How do we gauge and how do we create the amount of money that those people at the very top are getting? They are getting huge windfalls, aren't they?
Well, what happened was the executive order that was entered under President Johnson actually tried to cap executive pay. Unfortunately, they kept it at the high executive salaries, the highest executive salaries in the private sector. You know what's happened to executive salaries in the private sector. They've gone through the roof. Now, the key to this is really that even though they are capped at this level, they're not capped at that being their total income. In other words, the company can pay them anything they want to. The only cap is what the taxpayers, how much the taxpayer money can be used to pay that $750,000 that some of them make. So,
well, so in other words, Howard, what you're saying is there was a day when you could have, when a law might have, an executive order might have been relevant to say, look, you can only pay the executive that has a contract for the government. You can only pay that executive a certain scale based on the rest of executives in the business. And when that was done, these executive bonuses weren't, $1 billion, $2 billion, $500 million. Some of these ridiculous, outrageous CEO pays that we see now. Overnight, that changed, and now because of that, a corporation, a subcontractor corporation who's getting taxpayers' money can justify paying that CEO as much as they want, basically, right?
Yes, they can justify paying them as much as they want, but the real key to it is the cap is how much of the executive salary and compensation can be out of taxpayer dollars. So they could lower the cap and the executives could still be paid whatever the company thinks they're worth, but they could put the true cap on the taxpayer dollars. That's what needs to be lowered.
And that's been proposed. I've followed this a little bit. That has actually been proposed by some legislators who say we have to rethink this because the disparity between people at the top and people at the bottom is not just a function of what's happening in the private sector. Now we have government contractors that are doing the same thing, creating a disparity to where the middle class has disappeared. Kerry, what are things we can do? What are things that the U.S. government can do as far as making sure that taxpayer money does help build a middle class by not paying workers Walmart wages if they work for a government contractor?
One of the probably the most common sense approaches to this that hopefully is going to get some is going to pick up speed is capping the executive pay. The President of the United States makes $400,000 a year. All right, the Vice President makes $230,000 a year. The average median income in a household is $50,000 a year. So you bring down the executive pay for federal contract work, as Howard indicated. That doesn't affect the overall. That doesn't determine the overall executive pay. But if you put a cap on how much can be reimbursed per employee, bring it down from $750,000 down to $230,000. The compensation.
What our vice
president is earning. What you end up doing is you end up increasing the hourly wage to these poverty level workers by $7 an hour, $14,000 a year. You're giving them a chance to buy a house. You're giving them a chance to move into the middle class. And the fact of the matter is, at the executive level, you're not, relative to what they're earning, they can give up some of that income to help these low poverty level workers have a chance.
Right, because Kerry, really, well, Howard, you mentioned earlier, let me ask you this, Howard. This is something that's not happening in just the low, this is happening in the top tier of government contractors, the people doing technical government contracting, building jets, building high-ticket items for the government. This is happening all the way to the top, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's happening even in the aerospace industry, for example. But the major problems exist in three areas. In 2012, the federal government spent $30 billion in federal construction contracts. They spent $74 billion in federal infrastructure. And the SBA created 66,000 construction jobs with their loans. But in those three industries, in those three areas alone, there were 80,000 construction jobs where people are being paid less than the $12 per hour. They could address that. Then they could also address the areas like aerospace and the other areas that you're talking about, where even at the high end, the people at the top are making the good money, but they're very few. They're a very small percentage. Startling
numbers, an important story. Thanks for joining me, guys.
You're welcome.
Mike.
Coming up, we'll find out why the extremists in the GOP are turning their back on the same institutions who helped put them in power. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The Republican Party has always relied on outside think tanks to supply them with ideas and great talking points. But in recent years, the extremists who've taken over the party have turned their backs on some of the most powerful Republican think tanks in the country. I have Joe Cotchett and newspaper publisher Rick Outzen with me to talk about why this is hurting the GOP. Joe, Molly Ball wrote a great article in The Atlantic, as she usually does. I mean, she always just gets it right. And she talked about the evolution of the Heritage Foundation, how it once was a fairly principled organization that created new ideas, new concepts, innovation about politics in America. And that the evolution these days has had a pretty bad ending. What's your take on her view of that?
Well, you're absolutely right. It was not only a prestigious foundation, it had some terrific ideas. It started the whole concept of enterprise zones in minority areas. I mean, this was not a GOP Republican operation. It was truly, if you want to use this word, an independent operation started by a lot of principled thinkers. Now, what has happened, it has been taken over by the Republican Party. They grabbed it because of the concept of conservative ideas. They grabbed it to the point where they're running away with it and attempting to take it from its original roots and now use it as a hammer over Republican congressmen that if you don't agree with me, I'm going to run somebody against you in the primary. And their ideas have now gone from intellectual ideas to right-wing wacko concepts.
Yeah, Rick Outzen, there was a day when great thinkers were actually in charge of what was happening around the Heritage Foundation. Now we've gone from there to Jim DeMint. Really?
Really. And I think that's exactly what the issue is, you know, when you have the Republican congressmen take over the foundation, then it becomes a completely different foundation. And what we're now seeing are new faces in the Republican Party, but the same old message that it didn't play well last year, it didn't play well 10 years ago, it maybe played well in 1980, and that's how far back we're going.
Joe, there's a little bit of an irony here. In 1973, the Heritage Foundation came out with some critically important ideas about how we can improve politics, how we can improve our culture in the United States. And I don't care whether you were liberal, moderate, or conservative, you had to look at that first report that came out in 1973, even though it was quite long. I remember having to read it and analyze it in college and say what's right about this, what's wrong about it. But there were some great, original, decent thinkers there that said we're trying to do better for culture. What is that morphed into now?
Well, let's go back and let's look at what it was. It was called the Mandate for Leadership, and you're absolutely right. It's had some fabulous ideas. As a matter of fact, Clinton's whole concept of moving from welfare to jobs came out of that Mandate for Leadership. Whether you agree with all of that or not, It had some intellectual thought. Let me tell you where it's gone today. It's gone to the abortion issue. It has gone to the immigration, keep all immigrants out of the country. It has gone to a right-wing platform. It has morphed into that, and you're absolutely right. Jim DeMint has taken this thing. They're turning it into a right-wing fundraising operation and attempting to scare, if you will, decent, moderate, and there are a lot of them out there, Republicans, into this thought that we have to become an isolationist country. We got to pull in all these programs that government needs to put in place. We deny global warming. That's one of their positions, by the way. And what common sense could disagree with that? But that's where it's gone. It's gone from an intellectual
Joe, this was a once respectable organization. Now, I don't think there are few people that kind of hang out to the left as far as I do. But I used to read their material, and I would say this is a great thought. This is a great idea on how to tax in the United States. This is a great idea on how to take care of social net programs. They had good ideas. As you point out, the first mandate in 1973, I mean, it was this monstrosity of a piece of work. It took weeks to read it. But in there, you had policy making at its truest in its truest form. Rick, now when you take a look at it, the intellectual progress of the Heritage Foundation has been completely thwarted by kind of that teabag mentality that's now in charge of the talking points, haven't they?
Mike, that's one of the points that I think need to be brought out. There's no difference between the Tea Party and the Heritage Foundation now. You know, there's no intellectual debate happening over there at all. It's all taking the same ideas that the Tea Party pushed through, and I think, you know, you're right. It's all about fear. It's all about trying to play to an older audience that's out of step with the rest of the country.
Joe, there used to be a time when the Heritage Foundation, they would have a data analysis aspect to their foundation, and you could actually take a look at it and it would have some believability about it. You could take a look at the Heritage Foundation analyzing very important facts, whether it's demographics, whatever it might, economy. You could look at their numbers and you could say, at least we can believe they're credible, and at least we believe that their conclusions are at least sincere in their mind. And if you looked at the numbers, some of the conclusions that they reached were almost the same thing that the OMB for the U.S. government would reach. What have they used that for now, that data analysis? What do they do with it now?
Because now they're distorting it. But to go back to the point you just made, an original concept, remember the mandate for leadership contained a whole issue on tax. And their original position was, we got to stop Wall Street from using and abusing the tax code, which is now hundreds of pages long. They wanted to go back and make it simple for middle America. It was an idea that's time has come. That has now all been distorted. It is now all out the window. And as Rick just pointed out, it is a terrorism organization. By the way, they're now called Heritage Action. And Heritage Action now goes into Republican strongholds and terrorizes the local moderate Republican who at one time had been for tax reform and now won't talk about it, had one time been for women's rights and now won't talk about it.
Yeah, at one time had been great on the environment, but now they won't talk about it. At one time, Rick, one of the ironies here is the Heritage Foundation in 1973 actually laid out the program for public health care. It was even more involved, more government intense than what Obama's plan is for health care. But now, of course, you have Jim DeMint out on the front lines using this Heritage Action group that Joe just described as a way to try to destroy the possibilities of Obamacare taking place in the United States. That's just one of the ironies. I think the other big irony is there was a time when you had liberal intellectualism that was a standalone. There was no conservative intellectualism. I mean, I don't know. I know that sounds like an overstatement, but that's not just me saying that. That's historians saying there was a time when there were no new ideas coming out of the Republican Party, and all of a sudden the Heritage Foundation came along and they gave some credibility to intellectual thought. What's that evolved into now?
Well, I don't know what it's evolved into now. It's more of a circus. It's about how to stop Obamacare. It's reactionary, negative. But Pat, let's go back to the 70s. I mean, the thinker at the time was William Buckley. That was the only thing the Republican Party had in the 70s. The Heritage Foundation brought in young, aggressive interns who looked at the economy, looked at social welfare. They would never have thought about restricting voting rights like we see now. They would never think about stopping immigration or building a wall around Arizona to keep people from coming into the country. All these ideas would have been laughed at by the Heritage Foundation in 1973.
So, Joe, the new ideas, I mean, it's kind of, it has to be embarrassing for the Republican Party. In the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s, there were real statesmen that added some volume and some weight to the Heritage Foundation. These are statesmen that at one point worked for government. They would move into the Heritage Foundation. They were great thinkers that left government and then moved to the Heritage Foundation to try to formulate great ideas rather than penny ante crazy talk. And so now, who do you really draw from now? Sarah Palin, Bobby Jindal, are these the statesmen that are going to define the Heritage Foundation's thought process now?
They are not, and to the contrary, all of the people who founded the Heritage Foundation are now out on the street. They've been pushed out of the organization. Go back to that point you made about medical public policy. Mitt Romney, when he ran for the governor of Massachusetts, adopted what we now call the Affordable Care Act. And as we know, the state of Massachusetts has that wonderful plan in place, which was a Heritage Foundation documented piece originally. So what's happened now? Everybody who was in favor of that plan of the Heritage Foundation has been pushed out. Jim DeMint just pushed out the former executive director and has taken it over and using it as a rallying cry for right-wing nutcake ideas and raising millions of dollars doing it.
Yeah, so it's all about the money, Joe. I wanted to ask you also, you mentioned earlier that one thing that you see the Heritage Foundation, the new Heritage Foundation, the kind of the nut job Heritage Foundation,
now
they're
called
having
Heritage
a big
Action.
Yeah, Heritage Action, that's correct. Well, one thing that you see them having impact in is primaries for Republicans.
There you
What
go.
is that doing to the Republican Party?
It's tearing it apart. As a matter of fact, to be quite candid with you, in 2012, it saved the Democratic control of the Senate. Because remember, but for those primary battles in a couple of key states, the Democratic Party may have lost those states to Republicans. So it's tearing it apart.
Rick, very quickly, about 30 seconds, you have the Republican Study Committee, which is a really, really right-wing bunch of moonbats. That's the only way I can describe it. They are now in charge of the narrative and the dialogue. They've run the Heritage Action Group out, the Heritage Foundation, the old folks from the Heritage Foundation that were real thinkers. Doesn't that tell you a lot about where the GOP's headed here?
Oh, it is. It's all the same old ideas. It's going to be crazier. I think Joe has nailed it on the head. To win a Republican nomination, you're going to have to be so crazy to get the nomination that you're going to alienate the general voter out there. And that's what I could see happening next year.
You almost get the impression that they don't really care because it's a state-by-state strategy. It is the idea we control the states, we'll control the American culture, American politics. Joe and Rick, thank you for joining me. This is an important story because it is telling us the story about where the Republican Party is headed. Thank you. Coming up, we'll find out how the U.S. Supreme Court has made it harder to sue big banks for their illegal activities. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The list of crimes being committed by America's biggest banks is almost endless, but the Supreme Court has made it harder and harder for consumers to take these criminals to court. Joining me now to tell us about this is attorney Peter Mougey. Peter, America's legal system, again, protecting Wall Street to the detriment of Main Street. Consumers don't have a chance anymore. This last case that came out where you had class actions, that was the only way for consumers to proceed against Bank of America. The court takes that right away at the lower court and at the Supreme Court. Talk about how bad this is for consumers.
It's gotten ridiculous. I mean, if you are a consumer, Main Street consumer, and you have a smaller claim, and I say smaller, I mean it could be six figures, low six figures, what the courts have effectively done, what Congress has done through legislation, especially on the securities front, is narrow down to where the Main Street does not have redress for a smaller claim, and you've seen that.
Well, in this case, Bank of America, we knew that they were falsifying documents. They were lying to homeowners about the foreclosure process. They were actually forging signatures dealing with the foreclosure process. They were creating documents that they simply created out of thin air. We knew they were breaking the law, so people brought a lawsuit against them, and they made it into a class action, and the judge says, no, you can't go forward with a class action. So what does that do to a consumer if the consumer has to handle these one at a time?
If they break out these cases and they force them to bring it one at a time, which is what happened in Bank of America, no matter if they lied, they cheated, they stole, you have evidence of the same, it makes them bring an individual case. And as Pap, as you know, that bringing an individual case over $15, $20, $25, $100,000 against one of these behemoth international companies like Bank of America is almost impossible. The people can't afford it. So essentially what they've done is the door's shut on seeking redress for this fraud because the folks can't afford to bring these size claims against these huge companies like Bank of America.
And what the court is saying, no, every one of the individuals have to bring their own claim. Each claim may cost, if you're going foot to foot against Bank of America, just to get to court could be anywhere around $100,000 per claim just to get to court. And the average claimant with the Bank of America case, they were people who were foreclosed on because they couldn't even pay for their house. How are they going to pay for legal representation in a setting like that? It makes it impossible, doesn't it?
Think about it this way. Let's say there's an expert that you need to prove your case. And in a class case, which just simply means you can bundle all these cases together, you can bring the expert in one time, review the documents, and give the testimony one time. If you have each individual case, mom and pop type homeowner have to hire that expert in every single case. And it's typically not uncommon for us to spend well into the six figures just on an expert. If you make mom and pop hire that expert in every single case one at a time, you can't get any of the efficiencies, any of the economies, and it effectively bars the Main Street from bringing a case because they can't afford to bring those kind of experts in, that type of firepower that you need to bring a case against Wall Street or against big corporations because you just can't afford it.
At the Supreme Court level, the conservative, I call them conservative thugs, they're really not even judges. They're simply an extension of corporate America. If you look at Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, they all come from corporate America. That's where they made all of their money. So now, when they made decisions on, for example, the AT&T case, where you basically left everybody to meaningless arbitration, or the Walmart case, where they said women may not bring cases in discrimination cases because there's simply too many. That was actually the reasoning. When they made decisions like that, they knew that their marching orders, when they were sat on the Supreme Court, when they got that appointment, they knew their marching orders from corporate America was to make it difficult for consumers to ever sue big corporations like Bank of America. This is an example right here of exactly how it works, isn't it?
Well, take the AT&T case you mentioned. Essentially what that AT&T versus Concepcion case said is you're forced to arbitration. If there's a bar in the agreement barring class actions, you can't bring one. So now the Supreme Court said if there's a bar in the arbitration agreement saying you can't bring a class, you can enforce that. So that essentially says as long as fraud is small, it's cheap, because the victims don't have a remedy. They don't have nowhere to go because they can't bring a class, and in big Wall Street, big business knows that they can't afford to bring these smaller claims.
So you get to steal from consumers at $10,000 or $20,000 per person, and you can steal as much as you want, because you know even if you steal it, the government's not going to throw you in jail because the U.S. Justice Department doesn't have any guts. And second of all, you don't have to worry about going to court, because in the end, there's not going to be a class action. Individual lawyers are never going to be able to handle individual cases for thousands of people where you have to pay experts $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a piece simply to come to court. Peter, this is just a continuation of Wall Street dominating both politics and the civil justice process in America. And frankly, I'd love to say that I see a possibility of things getting better, but I really don't. Peter Mougey, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thanks for having me.
There are a lot of questions that remain to be answered about the recent Navy Yard shootings, like how a mentally unstable man was able to purchase a firearm. These questions could likely be answered in a slew of upcoming lawsuits, and I have attorney David Haynes here to explain how that is. So David, the shooter, Aaron Alexis, that whole incident at the Navy Yard, the more I'm looking at these facts, I'm convinced it was completely avoidable. What's your take on it?
Well, that's a real tragedy here, Pat, for the families of these 12 civil servants and contractors that lost their life. This was a totally avoidable incident, and we have multiple failures, unfortunately, in a number of areas, primarily in the background check system, of course, as well as employee supervision, and then, of course, with our lax gun laws that allow this tragedy to occur. There are any number of failures. There's civil liability to go around. But
well,
also,
let me ask you that. You're probably we are a premier attorney in Washington, D.C. that handles the most complex cases. And when I first looked at this case, I thought the difficulty with a civil case would be that the contractor would be considered a quasi-government agency and maybe have some immunity on decision making. I think you disagree with that, and I hope you're right. Tell me what your take is. If these families want to proceed against the contractor, in this case was called the Expert Incorporated, tell me what you think the possible legal avenues might be.
Well, that's exactly right. We do believe that there are very cognizable and real claims against these contractors, including the Experts, which was a subcontractor of HP, as well as USIS, which was the private company that was contracted to do these background checks, which totally failed. Is a very interesting story in and among itself, Pat. This is a company that was spun off of OPM in the 90s as part of the privatization effort, later bought by hedge funds, and was doing thousands of background checks a week, supposedly, except they really weren't doing the checks. These employees actually brought a class action suit against USIS. They had laptops were being left at Starbucks, at Chuck E. Cheese's. It was a totally unsecure environment that allowed us, this Alexis man and others, they did the background check for Snowden as well, to fall through the cracks. So,
well, let me ask you something. There was a day when the government did the background checks. They actually had the FBI or the CIA or the agency that works directly for the government. And now what we've done is we've contracted this out to private contractors, and we're seeing very shoddy, well beyond what we consider negligent work. It's almost reckless conduct by these companies. And you're seeing that in this case. And explain why. Give me the facts of what you would present to a jury if you were saying, here's the case and here's why it's important.
Well, that's absolutely right. As I mentioned, USIS was privatized in the 90s out of OPM, and they were given the federal database. But what has happened in the present day is that they are doing about 45% of all government background checks, and they're not clearing these people appropriately. The employees that complain that they had 50 background checks a day to do, if they're done appropriately, there should be probably about 10 in-person interviews. Alexis had a history all over the country, in Texas where he discharged a firearm up through the ceiling, in Seattle where he shot out the vehicles of a construction crew next to him, in Rhode Island where he said that he was hearing voices in the hotel and was clearly mentally unstable. This is a man that should have never been on a government property, should have never been doing this sort of work. And the company, the experts, quote unquote, said that they were bringing him home but never did. So this is a multiple systemic failure across the line. Alexis should have never been there. Tragically, this is an incident that should have been prevented. We should have all of these loved ones still with us. And so we believe that there is significant civil liability that we'll be able to present to a jury. One family has already contacted our firm, the Cochran firm here in D.C., and so we're actively investigating this incident. Our hearts go out to the other loved ones as well, but we anticipate being on the forefront of this legal action, which hopefully we can bring about change and reform. There's a lot of talk on the Hill about this, and of course in the judicial system, trial lawyers play a very important role to try to bring about change as well and prevent a future tragedy. Fort Hood, Sandy Hook, Aurora, now the Navy Yard. How many more of these incidents can go on, Pat? We need to bring reform not only to the civil servant, the background check industry, but also the gun laws here as well. This is a man that should.
Well, here we had a company that was making a lot of money from taxpayer money. This is a company that was that year in and year out was making millions in taxpayer. The taxpayers were paying them to do their job. And now we find out not only did they not do their job, but they did it to the point to where they took an incident that was completely preventable and turned it into an awful tragedy. How many people along the line dropped the ball? I think of the guy that let this guy out of the military, for example, without ever really telling the truth about how crazy this man was.
That's right. He was given a dishonorable discharge. That was the status. Alexis appealed to him because he wasn't going to be eligible for the GI Bill and to receive college tuition assistance. So his supervisor actually overturned that. That was the first failure, of course. In Texas, we had multiple law enforcement failures, unfortunately. So those incidents should have all prevented. If we had gun laws and real background checks where we looked behind these criminal contacts and didn't look just at convictions, but we looked at the police reports, what was going on, and we had real gun laws in this country, clearly this man would have never been able to take this Remington shot.
David, I take it you're going to test all of that, and I'm very optimistic that you're going to get a great result. It seems like the most important defendant you have in this case, though, is this contractor called the Experts. I hope that you will set an example for how contractors need to operate when they spend taxpayer money. David Haynes, Cochran firm in Washington, D.C., one of the best trial lawyers I know. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Pat.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringofireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.